Hello everybody and welcome to another video. With the release of Space Marine 2 and also because it's far overdue, I'm going to be painting the Lord Commander of the Imperium, Roboute Guilliman. Let's crack on. So one of the things that we're not going to be looking at today is how I built him. All that we need to know is that I kept the base and Guilliman himself separate for easier painting because I'm going to be spraying one with one colour and one with the other. The reason I'm spraying them separately is that Guilliman has an absolute ton of gold detail that's going to be far easier to paint if we just spray him with gold. I'm going to be using Games Workshop's Retributor armour here, others are available. I'm also going to be using matte black on the base from Colourforge because I want the base to be blue in the end and it's easier to dry brush up from a black than from a gold. Anyway, after spraying Guilliman, we're ready to do our first steps, which is to complete all of the gold ahead of time to make the next steps easier, so we're not coming back and adding gold over blue areas and so on. Starting with Reichland Flesh Shade, we're going to make a nice rich gold everywhere. It's very easy to then add some brightness back after the fact, but trying to add the shading after you've done some of the highlights can be a bit of a pain, and shades in general aren't necessarily precision tools. So I'm going to do this as a beginning and then let it dry. One thing that I didn't do here, because he's not a massive model, is go a little bit darker. You can of course use something like Agrax Earthshade if you wanted to have a dirtier gold. Again, I'm going for a richer gold, so that's why I'm using this flesh shade kind of skin tone colour. But if you want that dark, dirty gold, Nuln Oil, Agrax Earthshade, which are black and brown respectively, will also look excellent. Now it's time to move on to the overbrushing and the highlights. I'm using three different paints here. One, which is, hold on, I'm going to open, it's on a bit, there we go. As I was saying, one is a gold from Duncan Rhodes' Two Thin Coats range, which is my favourite, Dragon's Gold. I'm going to be using this as a bit more of an overbrush, which is very similar to a dry brush, you just have a bit more paint on your brush. I'm going to be applying this fairly liberally all over the entire model. I'm not worried right now of what is going to be gold in the future and what isn't. I'm just going to apply it according to the values that light give it. What that means is I'm holding it under my lamp and seeing where light falls, wherever the light's touching the model. It's what you own, Simba. It's also where the gold goes. The next colour I'm going to be using is Liberator Gold. It took me a little while to mix this guy up because he hadn't been used in a while, but it's a slightly brighter highlight colour, and this is a full dry brush just over those raised details on, again, probably the top 2/3 of the model. Basically, that just means I'm ignoring kind of between his legs, under his arms, and so on. The rest of the model is basically being covered in this, but I want to see some of my previous layers in between, so I'm not going absolutely crazy. The final colour is Vallejo's Airbrush Gold. I use these airbrush paints constantly with a normal brush because they're brilliant. You've probably seen me use dark aluminium, steel and silver consistently on loads of models, but the gold is also excellent. It's just really bright, so it's a slight misnomer because you can't really use it as a base layer. It's definitely a highlight layer if you're using it through a brush. Now, same as before, doing an even smaller part of the model, just those really, really bright highlight areas that you'd expect the light to hit best. And with that, the first stage of our model is entirely complete, and it didn't take too long, other than drying time. The issue is now we have to do all of the blue because he is an Ultramarine, and of course there's blue everywhere. This is going to take some time and a lot of patience. I'm using 4 blue paints, moving from Cantor Blue to Macragge Blue to Calgar Blue, and finally Fenrisian Grey as my highlight layer. So stand up, stop it, you're embarrassing me. The reason I'm starting with Cantor Blue is because it's a nice, deep, dark, rich blue, and I think it's going to be absolutely perfect as our base layer. Firstly, it covers well, and secondly, it means that I can layer up with my other colours afterwards. This creates a natural shadow for us. There's no real technique here, it's just a case of making sure this blue covers the entire model, except on all the gold parts, of which there are many, as we've previously established. So this is going to take some time. Just be patient, work your way through it. The next layers will be a lot faster. Actually, with that in mind, let's do a time lapse of this entire base coating process and see how long it took. So, enjoy. So around 45 minutes later, we have all the blue base coats down and Guilliman is starting to look good. These are the two main colours now blocked in. And with the gold being complete, we haven't actually got a huge amount further to go for the main detail. Moving to Macragge Blue, I'm now going to be layering this all over the Cantor Blue, but making sure the Cantor Blue stays in those lowest areas. So when I talk about lowest areas here, when you see his chest plate there, below the Aquila is where I'm going to leave some Cantor Blue. Likewise, anywhere that there's sculpted detail that I'd like to remain quite prominent, I'm going to make sure there's a bunch of Cantor Blue surrounding what is essentially a little island of Macragge Blue. It'll make sense on those sculpted abs and so on. As we do the Macragge Blue over the top, we'll make sure there's Cantor Blue in a little sea, a little river around it. Now this second process of layering up the extra blues only took about 10 minutes. It wasn't bad at all. The Macragge Blue was my most important one just because that's the Ultramarines colour and I want to make sure that was the prominent colour on the model. The next steps also weren't so bad, switching to Calgar Blue, which is another Ultramarine, brilliant, through to Fenrisian Grey is just adding those highlights and making sure that we're blocking in those details that we really want people to be looking at. On the Calgar Blue and Fenrisian Grey steps, it's a little bit more like traditional edge highlighting. It's just that the gold is all the edges, so I'm doing one where I'm kind of drawing highlights inside the gold filigree. The helmet's a good example of that normal edge highlighting, but as we get onto the other areas, you'll see that I'm essentially just sketching in rough highlights here and there. As you can see on top of the chest plate here, there's no edge to highlight, so we're just kind of making our own. Honestly, I do think this is a worthwhile process. If you can get through the base coating stage, which is easily the hardest part of painting this model, you might as well spend the time on this because it's only 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes to do this compared to the hour you've just spent blocking in blue. To be honest, after blocking in those really annoying base coats, I often feel like I'm riding a bit of a high, so I'm quite happy to spend time highlighting. You can see the model really coming together. When the most of the model is just two colours like this, you can see the results so quickly, you feel like you're achieving something almost instantly. It's a really satisfying model to paint, just get past that blue stage. Or if you spray in blue, good luck, I think painting the gold would be harder. As we were coming to the end of painting the highlights on top of Guilliman, I decided he was looking a little bit too desaturated. The gold was decent, I don't mind that, it looked quite realistic of all things, which I really enjoy, but the blue was looking a little bit too desaturated, not as vibrant as I would have liked, so I decided to add a pop of colour back into him. I played with a couple of ideas of how to do this. Commonly I'd use contrast paints or something with a high pigment count to do it, but I don't own really any blue contrast paints. I should really remedy that because I know they're really quite good. So what I did instead is take some Calidor Sky, which is a really nice vibrant blue from Games Workshop, thin it right down and start glazing it into those lower areas where the Macragge Blue and the Cantor Blue kind of meet. What this did is add an extra layer of saturation, so a brighter, more vibrant colour to what was otherwise quite a dull model. I don't mean dull as in bad, just dull as in almost realistic looking. And if that's your vibe, then brilliant, but I like really bright, colourful models, so that's the direction I wanted to go. This is a really simple process and doesn't take long at all, maybe 2 to 5 minutes, something like that, but you must be careful because if you add too much, you'll remove or cover up a lot of the hard work you've already been completing. Why have you got a shoe? Shoe removed from Arthur the puppy and back to Guilliman. Now, I think that's the blue complete and I'm really liking how he's looking, so it's time to block in all the other details. This is no different to many other models that you will have painted, but the problem is that you're painting over gold. Gold and metallics in general are quite hard to add base layers over, so often you'll find you might need an extra coat than you'd normally use. So I'm using Black Legion here for all the armor seals and joins, and I had to go over 2 or 3 times instead of the normal 1 or 2. Weirdly, even metallics don't stick to metallics very well. It's probably not actually that weird, that makes perfect sense, but I've said it now. I added a bunch of dark aluminium all over those areas that I wanted to be metal, namely the ammo feed and a few areas on the backpack. I think if you wanted to, you could get away with having everything on this model be gold that's metallic, but I wanted to break up some colours a bit more. But if you want to sort of stop a bit early, you can absolutely get away with have everything gold because he's already got so much bling. Moving on to the parchment, I'm layering up with the usual mix of Steel Legion Drab as a base coat, and then highlights of a bit of Xandri Dust, or perhaps some Ushabti Bone mixed with Steel Legion Drab, which basically creates that colour, and then Ushabti Bone as a highlight. I will be adding a bunch of text to these, but you won't see these on camera because I'll show you some freehand elsewhere instead. Now, during the painting process, the name on his shoulder, it's his name, it says Guilliman, had become slightly obscured, probably my fault, I don't know. So I went in with some Wildwood, which is a brown Games Workshop contrast paint, and made sure to fill in those letters. Initially, it was looking a little bit like nonsense as I was trying to decipher how it looked, but as we went along, it really started to look like an actual name, which is good because we want to be very clear who is wearing this awesome armor. Now, as promised, here's a small amount of freehand lettering. I learned this technique specifically from Darren Latham, who's the absolute master of painting. He used to work for Heavy Metal, and he currently works in the sculpting department in Games Workshop, so he definitely knows what he's on about. Basically, you start with the middle letter of the word first in the center of where you're writing. If it's an even number of letters in the word, you do the middle 2 letters. It's simple enough. Then you block in either end. So in this case, I've done the T in the center and then the U and the A either side of it. And then you fill in the rest in the middle. And this means that everything should be pretty well evenly spaced. When it comes to Gothic writing, you can add a few little dashes and splashes here and there, but don't go overboard. Otherwise, you could very quickly obscure what you're actually trying to write down. Now onto a few little highlights. We're going to be highlighting up the parchment everywhere on the model using a little bit of pale sand. A few more base coats here and there. I'm using Screamer Pink for the hilt of the Emperor's sword and also these beads that are hanging from his belt. I guess he likes beads. I'll also be doing the wax seals on the parchment at the same time and then highlighting up with a little bit of Screamer Pink followed by Pink Horror. One area that I didn't want to overlook was highlighting all those black parts, even though there aren't too many of them. I'm using a little bit of Basalt Grey, which is an AK paint, just to make sure that that's all covered off. Continuing with the theme of base coating, I'm going to use some pale grey blue from Vallejo to cover off the Ultramarines iconography on his shoulder and knee pad. Now, I may have forgotten to shade and highlight these, but we will perhaps catch it at the end before we get to the grand reveal. Ugh. Sorry. Whilst I was using this colour, I also base coated any lenses, not including his eyes, but on the back of his backpack he's got a few bits and pieces there. And I also took the opportunity to base coat the Emperor's sword. If you've ever seen the model, you'll know that the sword is a big flaming mess, so I'm going to be trying out some contrast paints and a mix of glazing and light layers and stuff to make a nice looking fire without too much effort. For the eye lenses, I went quite bright, starting with Mephiston Red and then highlighted up with Evil Sun Scarlet and a tiny bit of Wild Rider Red, before dotting the eyes with a little bit of AK Silver Grey, which we'll also be using to highlight or dot any other lenses and stuff across the model. After making sure that everything had had a chance to dry, so I wasn't going to be pulling away base coats as I started to layer on my next colours, I used some Citadel contrast paint, Eandon Yellow, all over the sword. This has a good amount of orange in it, so it's a good starting place. It's kind of a mid-tone for the entire weapon. We can go up or down from here, but I'm making sure as the paint is a little bit thick in a few areas, on purpose this is, I'm kind of pushing it to make sure it's thick in certain areas. I'm going to be pushing this onto the areas that I want to be darker naturally, like the flames themselves. It's also worth noting we haven't really talked about the base. There's nothing too interesting going on here, but I am also painting the flames at the same time. Back to the Emperor's sword, I'm going to be using some Grifthound Orange just to kind of blend with the Eandon Yellow layer that I'd done previously, focusing this towards the tip of the sword and also on those flames that are licking out the side of the sword. I'll also be doing this with some Blood Angels Red, but focusing it very much on the ends of the flames and maybe a tiny bit on the end of the sword. When you look at fire, red is not the main colour you'll see, it's probably yellows and oranges, so I want to stick in that kind of area. Jumping back to the base whilst we wait for things to dry, I'm going to add some brass colours to all the brass that's hanging around because he's been shooting fools. Likewise, I painted the little Chaos Black Legion Space Marine. Now with the sword again, I wanted to use some Ushabti bone just to add a quite bright power source to the centre of the fire. I wanted it to look like, unlike the artwork that you normally see, like the flame is coming from the hilt of the sword rather than it's kind of the other way around, it looks like on a lot of the images you see. So I made sure it was bright in the centre. That's just how I wanted it to look. I also made sure to clean up the base and add a base rim, which must be one of the most satisfying things you can do in the hobby. The painting of the base is complete, but there are a few more stages I want to do whilst I wait for my glazing layers of Ushabti bone on the Emperor's sword to dry. A lot of my Imperial armies are starting to share this kind of base, which is the blue with some bits and pieces on top, namely some autumn leaf litter to match my Sisters of Battle and a few bright flowers here and there. So Guilliman, being the Lord Commander of the Imperium, I thought would be where most of these Imperial armies are, so he gets the same base rather than matching the rest of the army that he'd actually be fielded with. Sounds a bit silly, but it makes sense to me. The autumn leaf litter, for anyone who wants to know, is from Green Stuff World, and I'm also using a bunch of purple and pink flowers from Gamer Grass, which is just the go-to for any basing materials that you want that's slightly botanical. Now the glazing on Guilliman's sword is complete and we can add him to the base with a small amount of super glue. Always a really satisfying moment to attach sub-assemblies or a model to its completed base. Now, as alluded to earlier, I completely forgot to highlight everything here, so I highlighted with AK Silver Grey on the U symbols and then also added a little glaze of blue to make it match. And with that, the Lord Commander of the Imperium is now complete. Thank you so much for watching. It's been too long. I finally have Guilliman. I've been Sam. See you next time.